Some of you may know the Reduced Shakespeare Company. I've never seen their work, but amongst other shows, they perform the complete works of Shakespeare in one evening. Their website states 37 plays in 97 minutes. They also actually do in one evening the Bible, brackets abridged, although that's not why I mention them tonight. I've not seen their work, but I imagine that it has the merit of forcing the writers to identify key themes in a complex story. You may think I'm taking on a similarly ambitious agenda tonight in discussing a history of Muslim views of the Bible. My aim is to tell the story of some of the different Muslim engagements with the Bible and to identify some of those key themes. So the topic is an issue not just for those interested in Muslim-Christian dialogue, but for students of the Quran itself. The umbrella title for today's event, Towards Understanding Each Other's Scriptures, could therefore be seen as of sharp interest both for relations between faiths, but also for shedding light on some Quranic verses. I'll take a few minutes to look at some background issues before we look at the Quran and the unfolding history. What do we mean by understanding each other's scriptures? To know them well? To sympathize with them? To know the history of how their followers have interpreted them? All of these are possible answers. The value of tracing the history of interpretation of a scripture is to put in context present-day attempts to understand, whatever meaning we give to that word. That history can help us avoid repeating pitfalls and build on good insights. But let us start, paradoxically, in the present. It's possible to find widely differing views of the Bible amongst Muslim authors today. Two writers writing in 2002 and 2003 illustrate this diversity for us. Abdullah Saeed, a Maldivian scholar working in Australia, has written, and I quote, "Since the authorized scriptures of Jews and Christians remain very much today as they existed at the time of the Prophet, it is difficult to argue that the Quranic references to Tawrat and Injil were only to the pure Tawrat and Injil, as existed at the time of Moses and Jesus, respectively. If the texts have remained more or less as they were in the 7th century CE, the reverence the Quran has shown them at the time should be retained even today." Unquote. On the other hand, Muhammad al-Azami describes the disparity between the preservation of the Quran and the corrupted state of the biblical text as midday sunshine versus the darkest shades of night. Now, more typical views might fall in between these two positions, but the question presents itself: how did we come to this point where such diverse views can be found? One writer has recently summed up Muslim views of the Bible as a combination of scorning and searching it. If scorning is sometimes too harsh a term, the Bible is often critiqued as corrupted and in its present form inferior to the Quran. The word most commonly used for corruption being tahrif. Yet the Bible is also searched for predictions of Muhammad and for other reasons which I shall explore later. Is this a contradiction? Another criteria for judging which parts might be corrupted and which predictive or otherwise useful? These twin engagements with the Bible for criticizing it and using it form the basis of my lecture today. It's ironic that a common apologetic argument against the corruption of the Bible is given by no less a figure than the philosopher Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. Now, this discussion of transmission is a technical discussion within Islam to do with how many people pass on reports and various other dimensions to do with their integrity, for example, much discussed by Muslims in relation to reports or hadith. While this is a very common criticism of the Bible, both ancient and modern criticism of its transmission, it's rarely set out in detail with reference to the details of Islamic legal thought on the issue of transmission more generally. The underlying issues regarding transmission raise many questions which cry out for more attention from scholars, some of which I've tried to address in an article on the crucifixion. Talking about reliability of transmission, I should say, shows the Gospels, for example, being treated as something more akin to the Hadith rather than to the Quran. Ibn Hazm's answer to the whodunit of who corrupted the biblical text is Ezra in relation to the Hebrew Bible. What about the New Testament? For Ibn Hazm, the Gospel writers were all at fault. In addition, Paul is a prime candidate for Muslim criticism, particularly in the Muslim West, Spain, where Ibn Hazm lived. Paul is charged with taking the pristine original teachings of Jesus, understood to agree with Islam, and turning them into the doctrines of the church as we know them, with Jesus as a divine figure. Indeed, Ibn Hazm states that Jesus would have had the pristine Torah, but that a radical break occurred in transmission shortly after him. So after Ibn Hazm, it seems much more common to assume the textual corruption of the Bible. But what about the second sense of corruption, that of corrupt interpretation of a sound text? There are, of course, options apart from accepting or rejecting a text, and an important one is the issue of metaphorical interpretation. Sometimes this can be used to say that a biblical text is acceptable, but has been misunderstood by its believers, and actually has a meaning much more in line with the teachings of Islam. For instance, rather than saying that if the Bible describes Jesus as the Son of God, it must therefore be corrupted, it's argued that Christians have simply understood what son means. There is a work called, and the title indicates a lot, The Fitting Refutation of the Divinity of Jesus from the Evidence of the Gospel. This might or might not be by the famous theologian Al-Ghazali, who died in the 12th century. Here, in this work, the Gospels are used extensively to affirm the truth of Islam. It's sometimes argued as a result that the writer of this work, whoever he may be, accepts the biblical text as uncorrupted and only disputes Christian interpretations. I would actually question this. There is no explicit acceptance of the status of the Bible in this work, and I would argue that the use of it is more from tactical considerations than out of conviction that the text is uncorrupted. In other words, if you can convince someone using their own texts, all the easier than trying to persuade them using works they do not accept. Now, moving on briefly to more recent areas, I found no evidence that Ottoman scholars developed new or unusual approaches to the Bible. We can't have time here to talk about the availability of the Bible and when it came into Ottoman Turkish, for example, which again complicates the story. Those few that were interested were content to reproduce criticisms assuming that the scriptures had been corrupted. In 19th century Iran, many works were provoked by the increasing level of interaction with the West and eventually with Christian missionaries, both Catholic and Protestant. There's a delightful name for a genre of works that arose called Refutation of the Padre. In particular, Henry Martin, the Protestant missionary, translated the New Testament into Persian and stimulated many rejoinders. Surveying these rejoinders, one modern Muslim scholar points to, quote, the acute failure of scholastic Shiism to modernize itself for the remainder of the 19th century. By contrast, interesting and more varied developments stirred in India. Here there was a famous debate in 1854 in Agra between a Christian, Karl Gottlieb Pfander, and a Muslim, Kairanawi. As a result of the Muslim speaker's friendship with a Muslim friend who had been a medical doctor in London, he was introduced to European biblical criticism. He used this to launch scathing attacks on the reliability of the Bible on the basis of new data rather than just traditional arguments. His work is freely available in English and other languages in Muslim bookshops today. He wrote up a book in Arabic some years after the actual debate. His views partly reflect a typical difference between Christian and Muslim ideas of Scripture, such that differences in versions, for example Hebrew, Greek and Samaritan versions of the Pentateuch, prove corruption. Knowledge does not always lead to sympathy. Ibn Hazm is the classic example of this. He demonstrates both a rare knowledge of the Bible alongside a rare hostility to it and its writers. This need not be a criticism of Ibn Hazm, but simply highlights what can be an unconsidered assumption today that familiarity breeds respect, while ignorance breeds contempt. Thirdly, general positive statements do not always influence treatment of particular passages. This is most clear over the issue of the crucifixion, which is frequently rejected even by those who state their broad acceptance of the biblical text. Finally, perhaps the most obvious point of all. On any issue, the Quran is the final arbiter over all other evidence. So if the Quran, in this historical sweep that I've been looking at, is understood to deny something in the Bible, all other evidence is subordinated. One implication of this is to add to reasons for Christians and other non-Muslims to study the Quran using whatever methods seem scholarly and appropriate. The Quran occupies such a massive role as the gatekeeper of Muslim faith and arbiter of the Bible that those on the outside of the gate will want to see what makes that gate so strong. This last point about the Quran as the gatekeeper of truth relates closely to the question. The Quran preserves at least remnants of truth which can be found in the Bible, in Muslim perspective. But secondly, this truth needs restoring, since it has become mixed with error. This act of restoring truth is seen by Muslims as the Quran's unique role. So Muslims naturally feel the need to both identify error, criticize, and look for elements of truth. We could take this further and say that the Quran is also the arbiter for how Muslims might determine which verses are predictive and which are corrupted, predictive or potentially useful. Those which agree with the Quran can be relied on. Those which conflict with it cannot. Al-Biqai states exactly this point in the 15th century in arguing that it's therefore quite safe to use the Bible, since the Quran provides, as it were, a safety net, preventing confusion over what is true. First, for Muslims. Can Muslims increase in their engagement with the Bible on its own terms, as part of forming their opinions about it? That means engaging with the best scholarship on the Bible by biblical scholars of whatever persuasion, although not, of course, necessarily accepting that scholarship. Many Muslim positions on issues of Quranic interest, such as the previous scriptures or the crucifixion, and on interfaith relations more generally, presuppose adopting positions on the Bible too. In addition to the general references between ideas of revelation discussed by Professor Ayub and many others, this has two specific dimensions. First, reflection on the significance of biblical genres, the fact that different Bible books function in different ways, and this affects how they are to be interpreted. Secondly, I quoted Abdullah Sa'id at the outset as saying that, quote, authorized scriptures of Jews and Christians exist today very much as they did at the time of the Prophet. Ibn Taymiyyah seems willing to say something similar. So can Muslims engage and continue to engage, in the case of those who do, with the biblical manuscript evidence, shedding light on this relationship between manuscripts available before and after the time of Muhammad? Finally, how might Muslim scholars respond to the diversity of Muslim source material on the Bible, some of which are touched on today? And some questions for Christians. Can more Christians make the effort to understand what the Bible looks like to many Muslims? That is, to understand Muslim perceptions. Secondly, can Christians take account of those perceptions in trying to communicate their own understanding of the Bible in ways which are meaningful and comprehensible to Muslims? Some obviously do this. Thirdly, what can Christians learn about the Bible itself from Muslim writings about it? For example, what Muslims choose to highlight about a given biblical passage may be very different from the way a Christian might read it. In this case, it can be helpful to have attention drawn to different sets of issues arising from a familiar text. Fourthly, what do Muslim approaches to the Bible teach Christians about how they might approach the Quran? And a final comment. We've looked at the past. As we look to the future, both Muslims and Christians in academia should be encouraging a culture of analytical, evidence-based discussion of each other's texts. We can ask a full range of questions, including sometimes hard or difficult ones. if we're using fair treatment of the data available. If this kind of evidence-based discussion can be promoted, then we may continue to take steps towards understanding each other's scriptures. Thank you very much.